Hi, AP Stats. This is Mr. Moon. Because some of you are on the Macbeth trip today, I'm going to record a quick lesson on 4.2a, and then I'm going to do another lesson on 4.2b. That should cover anybody that's missing class today due to the show, and I hope it's a good one. So we're going to be talking today about experiments and observational studies. After this section, you should be able to distinguish observational studies from experiments, describe the language of experiments, apply the 3 principles of experimental design, and design comparative experiments utilizing completely randomized designs and randomized block designs, including matched pairs design. We're not going to do all of that today. We're going to focus mainly on the first 2 objectives. So in contrast to observational studies, experiments don't just observe individuals or ask them questions. Last chapter we looked a lot at things that were correlated, and usually that data comes from an observational study. Right? We have variable x on the x-axis, we have variable y on the y-axis. We see if they're related based on data we've collected. However, experiments go beyond that. They impose some kind of treatment, and they look at the response in usually the subjects. So let's go into definitions here. An observational study observes individuals and measures variables of interest, but doesn't attempt to influence the responses. Whereas an experiment, on the other hand, deliberately imposes some treatment on individuals to measure their responses. So in an experiment, the researcher is taking an active role. They're imposing some kind of a treatment. In an observational study, we're really just collecting data. We're not able to affect anything about either variable. When our goal is to understand causality or cause and effect, experiments are the only source of fully convincing data. The distinction between observational study and experiment is one of the most important in statistics. These are very different tools, and we use them to get very different data. Here are some third variable issues, and observational studies of the effect of one variable on another often fail because of confounding between the explanatory variable and one or more lurking variables. Now I'll tell you that you'll often see lurking variable in the context of an observational study, and you'll often see confounding in the context of a poorly designed experiment. So let's get into these definitions. First, a lurking variable is a variable that's not among the explanatory or response variables in a study, but that may influence the response variable. So here's a case where you do your observational study, you're looking at the effect of x on y. Let's imagine maybe we were looking at the effect of chemistry grade on physics grade. And we notice in our analysis that there's a really strong relationship. But someone says, hey, I bet that's actually a lurking variable. I bet mathematical ability is really the one driving the physics grade and the chemistry grade, which is an interesting thing that can happen sometimes. On the other hand, confounding occurs when 2 variables are associated in such a way that their effects on a response variable cannot be distinguished from each other. So in other words, you're trying to change the treatment. This usually comes up more in the context of experiments. You're trying to change a treatment, but you also wind up changing something else. So let's imagine that I tried to impose the treatment of having you all study 6 extra hours the night before the test for our next chapter test. The problem with that treatment is that not only would I be having you guys study for 6 extra hours, you'd probably get 6 hours fewer of sleep. So I'm kind of changing 2 things at once. Even though I don't want to or mean to, I've kind of confounded this sleep variable with the study time variable. Well-designed experiments obviously take steps to avoid confounding. In my well-designed experiment, we might look for a chunk of time where you were not already planning on sleeping to do that study time, maybe earlier in the week. So just to check your understanding, Does reducing screen brightness increase battery life in laptop computers? So researchers grabbed 30 new computers of the same brand. They picked 15 of the computers at random. Notice random assignment is going to be a feature of experiments. And they adjusted their screens to the brightest setting. Okay, so we have a brightest setting group. And the other 15 laptop screens were left at the default setting, which is moderate brightness. Then we measured how long each machine's battery lasted. So was this an observational study or an experiment? This was an experiment because we applied a treatment. The treatment in this case was the brightness setting on the laptop. The experimental units in this case were the computers. So these are not human subjects. This is like just a study on an object, right? But it's still an experiment because we did impose a treatment on one group and not another. Okay, let's talk about the language of experiments for a moment. So an experiment is a statistical study in which we actually do something. We usually call that a treatment, though sometimes we call those treatments factors, to either people, that's a human subject's research, animals, so you often see medical research starting in animals and then moving to humans, or objects, like we saw in the last study. And those are all called the experimental units to observe the response in that unit. Going over some basic vocab, the condition applied to the individuals in an experiment is called a treatment. If an experiment has several explanatory variables, a treatment is going to be a combination of specific values of these variables. So a treatment might be this much study time and this much sleep. And a different treatment might have, 6 hours and 8 hours versus maybe 3 hours and 8 hours. That treatment could be a combination of values. The experimental units are the individuals where the treatments are being applied. When the units are human beings, we usually call them subjects and not units. Like I said, sometimes we call the explanatory variables factors, and when we do call them factors, we often talk about the levels of each factor. So that would be like the 3, 6, or 9 hours of sleep, things like that. Okay. Experiments are the preferred method for examining the effect of one variable on another. But that doesn't mean they're always well designed. So let's look at this case from page 236. A high school regularly offers a review course to prepare students for the SAT. This year, budget cuts are only going to allow the school to offer an online version of the course. Okay. Over the past 10 years, the average SAT score was a 1620. That was through the course in the classroom live taught. The online group, remember they've only been going for 1 year this year, gets an average score of a 1780. By the way, for those of you freaking out, this was the old system. We used to have a max of 2400. I realize that neither of these scores is possible anymore. Just deal with it. That's roughly 10% higher, a stat which I cringe at, and I can explain that if you want to take the time to come ask me about it. It's 10% higher than the long-time average for those who took the classroom review course. And the question here is, based on that data, is the online course more effective? I'm going to pause for a moment here. I want you to try to think of some thoughts on this, and then I'll give my answer. Okay, so at first glance, it looks like the online course is more effective. I mean, you got 1780 versus 1620. That's better, right? However, I noticed some problems with this experiment. First of all, the online group has only been going for 1 year. So we've got 10 years of data that we're averaging out, that's a 1620, and then we have 1 year, which could be a fluke. Maybe this year's class is just very strong SAT takers. They get a 1780. So I think there's not enough data from the online group. Okay? Secondly, this comes back to the idea about maybe this year is just particularly strong. We're comparing a different year of students to this year of students. That's a problem for me. I really, in an experiment, you want your two groups to be as similar as possible. What I would have liked them to do here would be to have two groups, right? Take one class, break it into two groups, give one group the online class, give the other group the classroom course. And if we could compare those groups in the same year, the classroom course versus the online course, that would be a lot more convincing to me. Okay. A lot of lab experiments use a design like the one in the online SAT course example. You take your experimental units, you give them a treatment, you measure the response. Usually you break them into 2 groups or more groups because of that. In the lab environment, simple designs often work really well, right? When you're working with rats, this tends to work well, or cells. Field experiments and experiments with animals or people, however, deal with more variable conditions. People don't always behave in the way you expect them to, and that can cause some errors. So the lesson here, outside the lab, badly designed experiments often yield worthless results because of these confounds. Okay, so you've got to be very careful with your experimental design. And I believe that's where we stop for today. So I'm going to pause here. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed Macbeth.